Hello and welcome back to our course on Adobe Dreamweaver CS6. In this section of the course we're going to start to build our first website. You should have decided on a topic for yours. If you can't think of anything at the moment, then you could pretty much follow along with the example that I'm using. My first website here is going to be about a nature park called Springs Park. I'm going to build this at least twice during the course. I'm going to start with a very simple version of it now, a sort of prototype, and I suggest that you follow this straightforward approach on your first attempt as well. And then later on in the course I'm going to use some of the newer features of Adobe Dreamweaver CS6 to produce a different and improved version of the website. So I'm just about ready to get started. I hope you are too. Now there's something you're going to need to do before you really get started, and that is to create a folder which will be the local root folder, root R-O-O-T, root folder for your website. Now generally speaking, almost exclusively when you're working on a website, the files will all be in your local root folder and its subfolders. Now I'm going to explain that in quite a bit more detail in a moment, but just to begin with, make sure you've got a folder currently empty that you can put all of your files in. Now my wildlife park is called Springs Park, and I've got a folder here on my desktop called Springs Park. It's currently empty. If I double click I'll see that it's empty, and that's where the files for my website are going to go. So you need to do pretty much the same thing. Now the good news is that once you've decided where to put your website and you've created the folder, Dreamweaver does most of the rest of the hard work for you, under your direction of course. And we are now going to set about creating our new site using the root folder that you just created. Before we do that, I want to mention something very important. This is a bit of a recurring theme throughout the course. One of the things that makes Dreamweaver such a large and complex package nowadays is that there are many ways of doing things. One of the most important things, for example, that you'll want to do is to create a new website. And if you look at the menu system here, there is a Site menu. Click on Site, down comes the drop down. The top entry there is New Site. So we know that that's one way we can go about creating a new website. On the other hand, if I go up to the application bar that I mentioned near the beginning of the course, there is a specific site button there. Click the drop down. One of the options there is New Site. Now typically within Dreamweaver there are several ways of doing many of the operations and actions that you may want to perform. It would take a very, very long time, and this would be a very, very long course, if I showed you every way of doing something at each point. So I'm generally going to choose one way, the way that I normally use, and as we go through I will try to point out alternatives at various places. But you'll find after you've been using Dreamweaver for a while that you may prefer a different approach to the approach that I use. Try to follow mine for now, maybe experiment with different ways, and don't forget, there's no substitute for experience. Once you've tried something a couple of ways and then tried it a couple of different ways, you'll soon decide which way suits you best. So let's set about creating this new site. So we click on New Site and we come up with the site setup for unnamed site 2. Now the first thing to do is to give the site a name. I've already decided my site is called Springs Park, and the local site folder is given a default location. Now of course I've already created my local site folder. This actually points out to you that Dreamweaver would create a folder for you if you wanted to, but it will put it in a default folder, which may make it a little bit difficult to manage. So I always choose the location first. Now I'm going to browse to find the folder that I set up. Put it on my desktop. There it is, Springs Park. So I double click on that. Click on Select. And you'll see that the folder I created has been selected as my local site folder. Now it is very important to remember what we've just done, because it is the basis for working with a website in Dreamweaver. We refer to the site by name, in my case Springs Park, and Dreamweaver keeps track of all of the files, whether they are HTML pages, whether they're images, whatever the components of my website are. Dreamweaver remembers that if I'm working on the Springs Park website at any time, that's where all of the relevant files are kept. So Dreamweaver is great at knowing where everything is. We just need to make sure we set up our local site folder, our root folder, in a good location. Now within this site setup dialog there are several other options. There's servers option, version control option, and a number of advanced settings. Now several of these we're going to need to look at in detail later on. I'm going to come back to them as required, but for the moment all we need to do is to say that the Springs Park website is kept in this folder and its subfolders. So click on Save, and what Dreamweaver now does is to create the website. Now when it's done that, it pops up immediately a panel here, the Files panel, and with it the Assets panel. These two are currently glued together. I'll explain that to you a little bit later on. With these panels, apart from the fact you can move them about, you can also make them bigger and smaller. Just drag by the corners, drag by the tops, drag by the sides, the usual Windows way of dealing with Windows. And what the Files panel does at any time is to tell me exactly which files are in my website. It keeps track of all the files, hence the name, the Files panel. So I can now, at a glance, without going into say Windows Explorer or my computer, I can get an up-to-date listing of the files in my website just by looking at the Files panel. By the way, there's a button here, a refresh button, which when I've done a certain amount of work, if I want to just refresh that listing, I can click that button. So there's not much in the site at the moment, so nothing to get particularly excited about. Don't forget, if I click on the window menu here, you'll see now that because Dreamweaver itself opened the Files panel, the Files panel is showed open. I can close it just by clicking there again. The other thing I can do, which is often the better option here, Files and Assets I tend to use quite a bit. Just use the little double arrow there which says Collapse to Icons, and it becomes a much smaller panel that you can pretty much put anywhere on the screen that you want to. So I could just drop it down there for now to keep it out of the way. So now it's time to put some content into our website. Earlier on we used the welcome screen and this create new HTML button option here to create a blank page. This time we're going to do it a different way. We're going to go to the file menu and click on new, and we come up with the new document dialog, which contains many options for creating new documents in Dreamweaver. Now quite a bit of the time what we'll be wanting to create is a blank page, and that's the option we're going to use this time. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But there are other things we will create at different times. For instance, we may create a blank template. Now I'm going to come back to templates a little bit later on. Very important part of working with websites. And the third option here is related to the new feature in Dreamweaver CS6, which is the fluid grid layout. Now this enables us to create websites which are adapted to mobile devices such as mobile phones, as well as devices such as tablets. Now we're going to devote a section of the course to fluid grid layout quite a bit later on. For the moment I'm going to stick with the more conventional type of pages and page creation. Now there are a couple of other options here. There's page from template, page from sample. Come back to those later. It's really blank page that we're interested in this time round. So we're going for blank page. We have a number of choices for page type, including HTML, the one we used before, but we also have HTML template and then various other kinds, some of which you may have heard of, some of which you may not. So we can, for instance, have CSS pages, we can have ASP JavaScript or ASP VBScript pages, ASP.NET pages, PHP pages, and so on. I'm going to talk about some of these later on. Let's stick with HTML for now. And then once we've chosen HTML, we have a choice of layouts. Now, the first page we created earlier on was just created from a blank page, but then there are a whole range of other layouts that we could choose. Now, the reason for choosing one of these layouts is it will normally save us quite a bit of work in terms of setting up the page. Now, with the layout options available, we generally have a choice between the number of columns on the page and whether the column widths are fixed or liquid. Now, let me start by talking about fixed and liquid. One of the continuing issues with websites is the ability to see the best of a website, whatever browser and whatever computer somebody is using to look at your website. Now, in the very earliest days of websites, computers tended to have quite poor resolution, started with a resolution of 640 by 480 pixels. Nowadays, resolutions go up to 1600 by 1200 and beyond, and unfortunately, just about every stop in between is available to somebody. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, browsers have also now gone down to work on devices as small as mobile phones. So if you were looking at setting up a page for a website, you maybe want something that's going to look good from a very small screen which might have only 240 pixels in width up to a very big screen which has got 1600 pixels in width. Now, the only common denominator, the only way of making that work perfectly would really be to only have the very smallest size as your fixed width image for your website page. So you would make a tiny website page which would look great on a mobile phone and would look absolutely tiny on a big PC. Now, one of the options available to you is to choose a fixed width for your website page. When you're previewing these pages in Dreamweaver, the padlock sign there says this is fixed width. It's got 2 columns, that's 2 columns fixed with a right sidebar. So the main part of the page is there, the sidebar is there, the widths are fixed. Now, if you were doing that, you'd have to choose a fixed width, which was some sort of compromise based on your belief of who's going to be looking at your website, what sort of devices you need to make it available to. Now, the other option is to go for a liquid setting. And if I look at 2-column liquid right sidebar, what happens here is that when your page is presented to the user in their browser, the amount of width that is allocated to each part is based on a percentage of the available width, which will depend mainly on the user's computer, but also to some extent what they have their browser set at. So the actual width they see is itself variable. Now, this sounds great, this sounds as though it's going to make the best use of the available space, but it has a very significant downside. And the very significant downside is that your pages have to be built in such a way that when they're presented to users potentially at different widths, they still look all right. So for instance, if your page was all text and the width varied depending on the user's computer and browser, would the text still look good on a very wide screen compared to a very narrow screen? And that's why the whole of this issue has really always been a very difficult one to deal with. And the introduction of tablets, smartphones and so on has actually made things significantly worse, because you're not just dealing with big PCs and big browser screens, you're talking about very small devices as well. Now on this occasion, what I want to do, because I don't want to get too wrapped up in this particular issue just yet, because we're going to come back to it later, is I'm going to choose one of the fixed sizes, and I'm going to use the 2-column fixed left sidebar header and footing setting. So there we are. The padlock tells me it's a fixed width. I've got a header section, a footer section, and a left sidebar here, and I'm going to click create to create the page. There's a section down here about CSS. Don't worry about that at the moment. Just click on create. And I now have my first page. Now the page that's been created has a lot of content that you probably have no idea what it's about. It's actually some very helpful instructions from Adobe. But the first thing we're going to do with this page is to save it, and we're going to start with that in the next section. So I'll see you then.